It was late October of 1998 when I decided to take a drive out into the mountains of northern Montana. I was 28 at the time, working long hours in a repair shop, and the constant city noise had started to wear me down. I didn't plan much, just filled the tank, packed some food, a sleeping bag, and an old map I found in my father's drawer. The map had a few handwritten marks, one of which pointed to a small spot near a dried-up riverbed and simply said cabin. I didn't know who marked it or when, but curiosity pushed me to see what was there. The road got rough after I passed the last gas station. Gravel turned into dirt, and the trees grew thicker, leaning over the narrow path like they were trying to keep the world out. My old pickup struggled up the steep parts, coughing and shaking as if it wanted to turn back. The sun began dropping behind the ridge, and the sky turned orange, then pale gray. I told myself I'd stop before dark, maybe set up camp by the riverbed. But when I reached it, there was nothing but cracked stones, dead weeds, and a long stretch of silence. That's when I saw it, the cabin. It was about 200 yards away, half hidden behind a cluster of pine trees. The roof sagged in the middle and the windows looked like black holes. I almost missed it because the logs had gone gray with age, blending into the woods. My first thought was that it might collapse if I even touched it. Still, I was tired, and the idea of sleeping inside something, anything, was better than lying out in the open. The ground around the cabin was soft with years of fallen needles and damp soil. I parked a little away and walked the rest of the distance. The air was colder there, heavy with that smell of rot and pine sap. When I stepped up to the porch, the wood gave a dry creak under my boot. The door was slightly open, as if waiting for me. I pushed it gently, and it swung with a long groan. Inside, it was dark, but my eyes adjusted slowly. Dust floated through the last beams of sunlight that squeezed through the broken window panes. The place looked like someone had left in a hurry decades ago. There was a table with one leg missing, a rusty stove in the corner, and an overturned chair that had been eaten by time. A pair of boots sat by the wall, both cracked and stiff like they'd been there forever. The smell inside was sharp and earthy, mold, rust, and old wood soaked in moisture. I checked each room carefully. There were only two. The smaller one had a bed frame with the mattress long gone, just coils and torn fabric left behind. I found a few empty cans in a box near the wall, faded labels that I couldn't read anymore. It was clear no one had been there in years. Still, something about the cabin didn't feel completely abandoned. The air was too still, too aware. I decided to stay. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor in the bigger room, near the stove, and lit a small fire using broken pieces of the table. The wood smoked badly but caught enough to throw a weak orange light around the room. I heated a can of beans and ate slowly, listening to the small pops and hisses of the fire. Every few seconds, I'd glance toward the door, expecting to hear something. Footsteps, wind, anything. But there was only silence. When night settled fully, the temperature dropped fast. The fire shrank, and the shadows thickened. I lay back, trying to sleep, but every creak of the old logs made my heart jump. The roof moaned under the weight of the wind. At one point, I thought I heard something brushing against the outer wall, like branches scraping, but when I looked outside through the window, nothing moved. Just black trees standing still against the pale moonlight. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't the wind or the wood settling. It was heavier, slow, uneven thuds coming from outside. I stayed still, my body stiff inside the sleeping bag. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. My first thought was a deer, maybe an elk wandering near. But then there was another sound, a metal clink, faint but sharp, like something hitting against a shovel or a piece of metal. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window. The beam caught nothing but fog and trees. My breath fogged the glass. I waited, listening. Then I saw something just for a second, a shape near the side of the cabin. It moved behind a tree before I could focus. I turned off the light and sat still, every sound around me suddenly louder than before. I could hear the faint crunch of footsteps again, circling slowly. It went on for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped completely. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for it to start again, but it never did. By the time morning came, my nerves were stretched thin. When I stepped outside, the air was cold and misty. Dew clung to the grass and the truck's windshield. I walked around the cabin, checking the ground. The soil near the side where I'd seen the shape was soft, and there were footprints. Bare ones, long and wide, pressed deep into the mud. Not animal, not boots, bare human feet. They led toward the trees and vanished among the pines. That made my stomach drop. I looked around the woods carefully, scanning between the trunks, but nothing moved. The place was dead silent again. I packed my things fast, ready to leave. But before I opened the truck door, I noticed something else. Near the porch steps, in the dirt, was an old rusted shovel. It looked like it had been pulled out of the ground recently. Still damp, with a chunk of clay stuck to the blade. Something about that didn't sit right. I walked a little farther, maybe 20 feet behind the cabin, and saw a patch of disturbed earth. The soil there looked freshly turned, darker and softer than the rest. I crouched and touched it, cold, loose, uneven. My mind started racing. Whoever had been walking around last night had been digging here, right behind the cabin. I don't know why, but I started digging with my hands. Maybe curiosity, maybe fear. After a few minutes, I hit something hard, wood. I cleared more of the dirt and saw it was an old wooden box, about the size of a crate. The nails were rusted, the corners falling apart. I pried it open with a stick. Inside were a few old tools, a couple of empty bottles, and something wrapped in a piece of rotted cloth. When I unwrapped it, I found a wallet. Cracked leather, faded and brittle. Inside was an old ID card, barely readable, but the name was still there. Thomas L. Grant. The date on it was from 1974. There were a few black and white photos tucked behind it. One of a man standing in front of a truck, another of what looked like the same cabin when it was still new. I stood there for a long time trying to piece together why that box had been buried and who had dug it up again. Maybe someone from his family had come back. Maybe someone else had been hiding something. But the footprints, bare, wide, and fresh, didn't make sense. When I finally got in my truck, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The mist was lifting, and sunlight was breaking through the trees, painting the roof in a pale yellow glow. It almost looked peaceful again, like nothing had happened. But as I drove away, I kept seeing that patch of turned soil in my mind, and those footprints circling the place. I made it back to the main road by afternoon, stopped at a diner, and asked the owner about any old cabins near the dried river. He said there used to be one owned by a man named Grant who vanished sometime in the late 70s. The police searched for him, but they never found anything. I didn't tell him what I'd found. I just nodded, paid for my coffee, and left. I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, when I wake up at night, I still hear that sound, the slow, uneven thud of footsteps circling in the dark. And I keep thinking about that patch of ground behind the cabin, how soft it felt, how it looked like it had been dug up more than once. Whoever or whatever was there that night hadn't been looking for shelter. They'd been looking for that box. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't finished yet. It had been raining since morning, that slow, cold type of rain that feels like it seeps right through your clothes no matter how thick they are. I had been driving most of the day through the back roads of Montana, somewhere between Great Falls and Helena, trying to find a spot of land I bought months ago, just a few acres out in the woods. My plan was simple: build a small hunting cabin by myself before winter came. I was 33 then, had no family, and I liked being alone more than I liked being around people. I had spent years working construction, and I figured I could put that skill to use on something that was actually mine. By late afternoon, the rain got heavier, the kind that blurs everything past the windshield. The dirt road had turned into a thin layer of mud, and the truck's tires kept sliding every few feet. I finally reached the clearing where the small creek cut through the trees. That's where I planned to build the cabin. The spot was quiet, too quiet maybe, but it felt right. There was a slope on one side and a cluster of tall pines on the other, blocking most of the wind. I turned off the truck, grabbed my rain jacket, and stepped out. The air had that sharp, wet smell of pine needles and earth. My boots sank into the mud with every step. I unloaded the plywood, tools, and the small stack of lumber from the bed of the truck, setting them under a makeshift tarp I had tied between two trees. The rain made a steady sound on the tarp, like small fingers tapping nonstop, and it gave the place a rhythm, a strange calm in all that grayness. I had planned to start early the next morning, but I didn't like the idea of sleeping in the truck all night with no shelter. The temperature was dropping fast, so I decided to start framing right away, at least get the floor and a few walls up before dark. I worked fast, sawing and hammering as the rain soaked through my sleeves. My hands were stiff, but I didn't stop. I could see my breath every time I exhaled. By the time the light started to fade, I had most of the walls standing, crooked, rough, but standing. When the darkness came, it came all at once. The trees swallowed what little daylight was left, and the rain picked up again. I lit a lantern and set it on a wooden crate near the unfinished wall. Its weak glow spread through the mist like a pale yellow bubble, barely reaching the corners of the clearing. Everything beyond that light looked like it was moving, even though I knew it wasn't. The sound of rain on the roofless frame, the tapping against the wood, the dripping through cracks. It was constant. I ate a can of cold beans and a piece of bread, sitting on the crate, listening to the woods. There's something about the forest at night that makes you feel smaller than you think you are. Every noise feels closer than it is. Every shadow feels heavier. Around 10 or so, I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the half-built cabin. I could feel the cold air sliding between the walls and across the floor. The lantern burned low, its flame twitching every time a drop of rain hit the metal roof sheet leaning nearby. At first, I thought I'd fall asleep quick, but my eyes kept opening every few minutes. The sound of the rain changed, sometimes softer, sometimes hard again. I tried to ignore it, but after a while, I realized something else was mixing with it. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on wet leaves, slow and deliberate. I turned my head toward the open side of the cabin. The light from the lantern didn't reach far, but I could see the edge of the tree line. My body froze for a second, ears straining. The steps stopped. I waited, not breathing, listening. Then they started again, this time closer. My first thought was that it was a deer or maybe an elk, but it didn't sound like hooves, it sounded like boots, heavy ones. I pushed myself up and reached for the hatchet beside my pack. The rain muffled everything, but I could still make out the rhythm of those steps. Slow, careful, stopping every few seconds like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. I turned off the lantern. The darkness hit me instantly, and my heart started pounding so hard I could hear it. I crouched near the floor, staring toward where the sound had been coming from. Nothing moved. The only light came from the dim glow of the overcast sky and the faint reflection of water on the wood. I stayed like that for what felt like 10 minutes, maybe more, until I convinced myself I was just hearing things. Maybe it was a branch falling, maybe an animal moving around. I laid back down, but I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard small sounds. The dripping, the shifting, the crack of something under weight. Then there was another sound, sharper this time. A metallic clink came from near my truck. That wasn't an animal. My body tensed again. I grabbed the hatchet and crawled to the edge of the wall, peeking through a gap in the boards. The rain made it hard to see, but I could just make out the shape of my truck about 20 yards away. The back flap of the tarp was moving. For a moment, I thought maybe the wind had caught it, but then I saw a shadow, just a dark shape leaning near the pile of lumber. The outline looked human, but it didn't move naturally. It was hunched, low, like it was searching through the stuff quietly. My throat went dry. I wanted to yell, but I didn't. I just watched. The figure lifted something, maybe one of the boxes, and then turned toward the woods, disappearing into the trees as silently as it had appeared. I stayed frozen there, staring at the empty space for a long time. I didn't chase. There was nothing to chase with, just a hatchet and a half-built cabin. The rain didn't stop. I waited until the sky started to lighten before I dared to move again. When I finally went to check, the box of nails was gone, along with 2 of my smaller tools and part of the tarp. The muddy footprints leading away from the site were deep, definitely from boots, not an animal. They led straight into the woods and disappeared near the creek. That morning, I packed everything I had left into the truck. My hands were shaking the whole time, not from cold this time, but from a feeling that someone had been watching me for longer than I realized. I didn't want to be out there anymore. I left the walls standing, the half-built frame soaked in rain, the floor already soft with mud underneath. I drove back toward the main road, tires sliding through the ruts, heart pounding every time I checked the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 2 hours away. I sat there in the parking lot, rain still drumming on the windshield, staring at my reflection in the glass. My jacket was muddy, my face pale, and I looked like I hadn't slept in days. When I finally stepped out to fill the tank, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a small handprint on the passenger side window, muddy, smudged, and pressed from the inside. I never went back to that piece of land again. I sold it a few months later without ever explaining why. Every time it rains like that, with that same cold tapping sound, I think about that night, the half-built cabin, the shape moving in the dark, the sound of wet boots just beyond the light. I built plenty of houses after that, but I never built another one alone. And when people ask me why I don't go hunting anymore, I just say I got tired of the woods. But that's not really the reason. The real reason is that sometimes, even now, when it rains hard enough, I still hear that same slow crunching sound. Boots on wet leaves, getting closer. It was late October 2018 when I decided to take a short trip out of London to a quiet part of northern England. I'd been working long hours, barely sleeping, and needed somewhere to clear my head. A friend had mentioned an old cabin outside a small village near the edge of the North York Moors. It wasn't a fancy place. No electricity, no Wi-Fi, just a wood stove, a single bed, and a view over miles of rolling fields that disappeared into dense woods. That sounded perfect to me. I wanted silence and distance. I left early in the morning, drove through stretches of empty countryside, and reached the cabin just before sunset. It sat about a mile off a narrow dirt road, hidden behind a tangle of overgrown hedges and dry stone walls that were half collapsed. The place looked older than I'd expected. The wood on the door was splintered, and the paint on the window frames had peeled away completely. There was a metal chimney poking out of the roof and a shed in the back that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Still, it felt calm. I liked the stillness of it, the kind you only get far from people. Inside, the cabin was small but tidy. Someone had cleaned it recently. There was a table by the window, a single chair, a narrow bed with a wool blanket folded on top, and an old oil lamp sitting beside a box of matches. The floor creaked every time I moved, and the air smelled faintly of damp wood. I unpacked what I'd brought, a thermos, some food, a flashlight, and a small battery radio. I lit the lamp, ate a bit, and sat down by the window to watch the light fade. By the time night came, the whole place was surrounded by fog. I could see only a few feet outside. The fog looked thick, like it was pressed against the glass. I remember thinking it was strange how quiet it was. No wind, no owls, not even the sound of leaves moving. Just a heavy, dull silence. I tried to read a book I'd brought, but I couldn't focus. The quiet started to feel wrong, like the air itself was listening. I told myself I was just tired from the drive. Around 10 that night, I stepped outside for some air. The cold hit me immediately. The fog had gotten even heavier. I could barely make out the shape of the shed 10 meters away. I stood there for a few seconds, just breathing, and then I noticed something that made me freeze. There was a faint shape on the far side of the field, almost impossible to see, but it looked like a person standing still, halfway hidden by the mist. At first, I thought it was a fence post or a tree, but it wasn't. The outline was too sharp, too upright. Whoever it was didn't move at all. I watched for maybe a full minute, waiting for some sign of life. Nothing. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried not to think about it. I told myself it was just a trick of the fog. The mind sees things in patterns, especially in the dark. I sat by the stove for a while, added a few pieces of wood, and eventually went to bed. Sometime during the night, I woke up suddenly. The fire had died down and the cabin was pitch black. I didn't know what had woken me, but my heart was racing. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound from outside, like someone walking slowly over frost or dry grass. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped, then started again, this time closer. It circled partway around the cabin and then stopped completely. I didn't move for a long time. My flashlight was on the table, but I didn't want to reach for it. After a few minutes, the sound didn't return. I eventually drifted back into a light, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. The fog had lifted, and a pale sun hung low over the hills. There were footprints in the dirt, small, narrow ones, leading from the field toward the back of the shed. I followed them. They stopped right at the shed door. The lock on the shed looked old, rusted, but it wasn't closed. It was just hanging there through the latch. I pulled the door open. Inside, there were a few tools, a broken chair, and a pile of firewood stacked against the wall. But in the corner, I noticed something odd. A damp, faded coat hanging from a nail. It looked like it had been there a long time, maybe years, but the bottom half was wet, as if it had been outside recently. I didn't touch it. Something about it felt wrong. I stepped back, closed the door, and made sure to properly lock it. That day, I tried to distract myself by hiking the nearby trail through the woods. The forest was quiet, but not in the same unsettling way as the night before. There were birds, the sound of wind in the branches, even a few deer that scattered when they saw me. When I got back to the cabin in the evening, the footprints had mostly faded. For a few hours, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. But that night, everything felt off again. The temperature dropped fast, and the fog rolled in even thicker than before. I could barely see past the porch. I stayed inside with the lamp burning, sitting at the table, trying to ignore the feeling that someone was watching from outside. Every time I looked up from the book I was pretending to read, I caught myself glancing toward the window. It was close to midnight when I finally saw her. The lamp was dim, and I was sitting by the window, staring out into the fog. There was movement, a shape gliding slowly past the edge of the clearing. When I leaned closer, I realized it was a woman. She was standing just beyond the edge of the light, half covered by the mist. Her clothes were strange, thin, old-fashioned, maybe a long dress or a coat that reached her ankles. Her hair looked stringy and pale, hanging down around her shoulders. What struck me most was how still she was. She didn't seem to be breathing or shifting her weight, just standing, facing the cabin. My throat felt tight. I didn't move. I watched her for what felt like forever. Eventually, she took one slow step forward, then another. I could see her face better, pale, with deep shadows under her eyes. She wasn't young, but she wasn't elderly either. She looked lost, but there was something in her posture that made my skin crawl. Her hands were at her sides, stiff, like she didn't know how to hold them naturally. I reached for the flashlight on the table, turned it on, and pointed it toward the window. The beam cut through the fog for a few feet, but by then, she was gone. I couldn't see her anywhere. I waited, heart pounding, but she never reappeared. I didn't sleep that night. Every little creak in the wood made me jump. I sat up in the chair, flashlight in hand, until the first light of morning came through the window. When it was finally bright enough outside, I opened the door and checked around the clearing. There were footprints again, smaller than mine, faint, leading toward the woods and then disappearing into the wet grass. That was the moment I decided to leave. I packed my things as quickly as I could. Before leaving, I walked over to the shed one last time, just to make sure it was still locked. It was, but the lock was hanging slightly open again, as if someone had been there during the night. The coat was gone. I didn't wait around to think about it. I got into my car and drove straight back toward the village. When I stopped at the first petrol station I found, I mentioned the cabin to the man behind the counter. He said the place hadn't been rented out in years, not officially anyway. Apparently, it used to belong to an old woman who lived alone and went missing sometime back in 2009. They searched the woods for her for weeks but never found anything. The property just sat empty after that. I didn't say anything else. I just nodded, bought a coffee, and drove off. Even now, I still think about that night sometimes. The fog, the footprints, the woman's stillness. I tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, maybe exhaustion or the isolation. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Not a ghost or anything supernatural, just a person. Someone who'd been out there far too long, living somewhere in those woods, watching anyone who came close. That's the part that unsettles me the most. Not that I saw her, but that she saw me too. It had been 5 years since my ex-husband, Daniel, passed away. The news of his death came to me in the middle of a cold January night. Heart failure, they said. He was only 42. We hadn't spoken much since the divorce, but hearing that he was gone hit me in a way I didn't expect. We'd spent 8 years together, most of it in that old cabin up in northern Montana, surrounded by pine trees and silence. I hadn't been back there since the day I left him, but last month, a letter came from his sister saying the cabin was now legally mine. She wanted nothing to do with it, and apparently he'd never sold it. For weeks, I tried to ignore it, but the thought of that place kept creeping into my mind. The memories weren't exactly good ones, but they were part of my life, part of the years I tried so hard to bury. Finally, on a cold October morning, I packed up my truck, loaded my dog Milo in the passenger seat, and made the drive up there. I told myself it was just to check things out, maybe clean up, maybe sell it. Nothing more. The drive took almost 10 hours. The farther I went, the emptier the roads became. The air grew thinner, colder, sharper. By late afternoon, the mountains were behind me, and I was deep into the forest roads. Muddy and uneven, half covered in wet leaves. It had rained earlier that morning, and the air smelled of damp wood and pine needles. Milo sat quietly, his eyes following every passing shadow. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than I remembered. The wood was darker now, worn and dry. The porch sagged a little, and one of the shutters hung crooked. The place looked like it had been forgotten for decades. My stomach felt tight as I parked in the dirt clearing. I stepped out and stood there for a while, just staring. The wind moved through the trees in a low hum. It was the same sound I used to hear lying in bed during sleepless nights after Daniel and I would fight. That same deep, hollow sound that made the woods feel alive. I tried to shake the thought off and went up the porch steps. They creaked loudly under my boots. The door was locked, but the key, his old one, still fit perfectly. Inside, the air was heavy with dust. The faint smell of mold and old would hit me right away. Light came in weak through the window, falling across the kitchen table where 2 chairs still sat. One pushed back slightly like someone had just stood up. I set my bag down and looked around slowly. Everything was almost exactly the same. The same chipped mug by the sink, the same faded rug in the living room, the same photo frames on the shelf with our faces inside them. My chest felt tight. I walked through each room, running my fingers along the walls. The bedroom was cold, and the bed was still made with the same blue sheets. A few of his shirts hung in the closet, stiff with age. On the nightstand sat his old watch, the one I gave him on his 35th birthday. It had stopped at 11:47. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, before I picked it up and slipped it into my pocket. Outside, the sun was already starting to drop. The forest turned darker by the minute, shadows blending together until the trees looked like a single black wall. I decided to stay the night. I had brought some food, water, and a sleeping bag. The cabin didn't have power anymore, but I found a box of candles in the kitchen drawer. I lit a few and placed them around the room. The flickering light made the place look almost alive again. Milo stayed close to me the entire time. He never barked or wandered, just sat near my leg, alert and stiff. Around midnight, I tried to sleep, but the floor creaked with every gust of wind, and the trees outside scratched softly against the walls. Every sound felt louder in that kind of silence. It wasn't fear exactly, but something else. Something that made me feel like I wasn't alone. Sometime around 2 a.m., Milo lifted his head and started staring toward the front door. His ears twitched. I didn't hear anything at first, but then came a faint sound. Metal against wood, slow and dragging. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear sniffing around the porch. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight. When I shined it at the door, everything went still. The sound stopped completely. I waited, listening. The forest outside was dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop. Then, after maybe a minute, there was a thump, soft but heavy, on the porch like something had been dropped. I felt the back of my neck tighten. Milo growled low. I stood there frozen, flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. I thought about opening the door, but I couldn't make myself do it. Instead, I waited until the sound faded away and the woods went quiet again. I barely slept after that. Every creak made me jump. By dawn, I was sitting by the window, watching the sun rise through the fog. When the light finally filled the woods, I went outside to see what that sound was. The ground on the porch was wet from dew, but in one corner, near the steps, there was a dark stain. Something that looked like dried mud or maybe blood. Next to it was a small metal tool, an old crowbar, rusty and half buried in dirt. My chest tightened again. I picked it up carefully. The edge was stained dark brown, and the handle was worn smooth. I knew I hadn't left it there. Daniel used to keep one just like it in the shed behind the cabin. I went around back. The shed was still standing, though the roof had partially caved in. The door hung open. Inside, most of his old tools were scattered across the floor, covered in dust and mouse droppings. But in the far corner, under a pile of rotting boards, there was a small wooden box. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were old receipts, a folded map, and a plastic bag with something inside, a driver's license. It wasn't his. The name was Robert Kelly. The picture was of a man I didn't recognize, maybe mid-30s, dark hair, heavy stubble. I turned the card over. The issue date was 2015, 2 years before Daniel's death. My stomach dropped. Under the license, there was something else. A small notebook, pages yellowed and stained. I flipped through it. Most of it was just notes about repairs, supplies, and hunting routes. But near the end, the handwriting changed. The last few pages were rushed, uneven, almost unreadable. The words that stood out were simple. Asterisk, he came to the cabin. Said he knew. I didn't mean to do it. If anyone finds this, I'm sorry. Asterisk, I froze. My mouth went dry. I read it again and again, but it didn't make sense. Who was he talking about? Who was Robert Kelly? I spent the rest of the day searching the shed, the yard, even the woods nearby, but there was nothing else. No sign of anyone, no tracks, just the forest and the cold air pressing in from all sides. By evening, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed up, locked the cabin, and left. On my way down the mountain road, I stopped by the small police station in town. I handed over the notebook, the crowbar, and the license. The officer said they'd look into it, but I could tell by his face that he didn't expect much. A week later, he called me and said the license matched a missing person report from 2015. A hiker who vanished near the forest trail not far from the cabin. They couldn't prove anything, but they were reopening the case. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I ended up selling the property that winter. Every now and then, I still think about those words in that notebook. Asterisk, I didn't mean to do it. Asterisk, I don't know what really happened out there in those woods. But I know Daniel wasn't the kind of man to confess easily. Sometimes late at night, when I hear the wind outside my house, it sounds just like it did up there in Montana. Low, steady, almost human. And every time, it reminds me of that cabin, that porch, and the quiet truth buried somewhere behind it. Maybe he didn't mean to do it. Maybe he did. Either way, I know now that some things aren't meant to stay hidden forever. It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to spend a week alone at my uncle's old cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. I was 27 then, burned out from work, tired of city noise, and just wanted some quiet. The cabin hadn't been used in over a decade since my uncle passed away, but I remembered it from when I was a kid. A simple wooden structure by a narrow dirt road, surrounded by endless pine trees and a lake that smelled like wet leaves and iron. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like a place where I could finally breathe again. When I arrived, the place looked smaller than I remembered. The roof was sagging on one side, the paint had peeled away completely, and there was a musty smell that hit me as soon as I stepped inside. The floor creaked with every step. There was no electricity, no phone service, just an old generator that I found half buried under a tarp in the shed. I spent that first evening cleaning, wiping dust off the counters, throwing out moldy jars, shaking out a mattress that smelled like old hay. I didn't mind. I liked the silence. The first few days went fine. I cooked on a small propane stove, read old magazines I found in a drawer, and took long walks by the lake with my dog, Rusty. He was a big brown mix of shepherd and lab, quiet but alert, always sniffing the air like he was waiting for something to happen. The nights were colder than I expected for July, and the forest around me felt alive. Not in a peaceful way, but in a heavy, watchful way. You could hear every crack of a branch, every rustle in the grass, like the woods were breathing around you. On the fourth night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of Rusty growling low. It wasn't his usual bark. It was deeper, almost trembling. I sat up in the dark and could hear him standing by the door, his claws scraping the floor. I figured it was just an animal. Deer came close to the cabin sometimes. I told myself that and lay back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside. I heard slow footsteps on the gravel path. Not animal steps, heavier, uneven, like a person walking carefully. I stayed completely still. Rusty kept growling until the sound faded into the woods again. By morning, I tried to convince myself it had just been my imagination. I walked around the cabin to check. The dirt by the steps was disturbed. A long, thin footprint, half erased by the night's moisture. It looked human but dragged at the heel, like whoever made it was limping. That unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Still, I didn't leave. I told myself I'd come here to clear my head, not to run back at the first weird noise I heard. That day, I decided to hike farther down the lake, following a narrow trail that led to an old clearing. Rusty ran ahead, sniffing and wagging his tail, but at one point he froze, staring into the trees. I looked too but saw nothing, just a patch of darker woods where the trees were thickest. The ground there was soft and sunken, covered in pine needles. I didn't stay long. I felt a strange pull to leave and I listened to it. That night I couldn't sleep. The generator had run out of gas earlier, so there was no light except for my flashlight. The air felt heavy. Every sound outside seemed too sharp, too close. Around midnight, I heard that same uneven crunching sound again. Slow, dragging steps on gravel. Rusty started pacing, growling low. Then I heard something brush against the wall. Not scratching, more like a hand or a shoulder brushing along the boards as it moved. I sat up, heart pounding, flashlight in hand, waiting. The sound stopped right by the window. I pointed the light there and saw the faintest shadow move away, just enough to make me drop the flashlight. By the time I picked it up again, there was nothing, just trees and darkness. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. Around dawn, I went outside to check. There were more footprints, long, dragging, and now they circled the entire cabin. In one spot, near the back, I found what looked like a smear of something dark on the wood. It wasn't fresh blood, more like dried mud or something mixed with oil. It smelled metallic. I should have left then. I even packed my bag halfway, but the nearest town was 20 miles away, and I didn't want to walk that far without sleep. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then go in the morning. That evening, it started raining. Not a light drizzle, but a heavy, soaking rain that drowned out everything else. The roof leaked in 3 places. I sat by the window watching the water slide down the glass, trying to calm my nerves. Rusty was restless, pacing near the door. When the rain finally eased a little, I heard something again, faint but clear. A single thud, like something falling outside. I opened the door just enough to look out. The rain had made everything shiny and black. The ground was slick. The smell of wet wood was strong. I shone my flashlight toward the shed. The door was open. I was sure I'd closed it earlier. I stepped closer, calling softly for Rusty to stay behind. When I reached the shed, the smell hit me first. A thick, rotten smell, like wet meat left out too long. Inside, one of the shelves had collapsed, scattering old tools and a broken lantern. But that wasn't what caught my eye. In the far corner, behind a pile of boards, was a dark bundle. I moved the boards aside and nearly gagged. It was a body, or what was left of one. A man, middle-aged, clothes half-torn, skin pale and bloated. His face was swollen beyond recognition. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. Rusty barked from the doorway, whining. I stood there, shaking, trying to think. The smell was unbearable. The man had been dead for days at least. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally ran back to the cabin and locked the door. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely hold anything. My mind was racing. Who was he? How did he end up there? Why hadn't I smelled it before? I thought about the dragging footsteps, the footprints, the way the door had been open. It made a sick kind of sense now. Someone had dumped him there recently. Someone who had been coming back at night. I knew I had to leave. It was already dark again, but I couldn't spend another minute there. I grabbed my bag, called for Rusty, and ran down the dirt road toward the main trail. The rain had started again, soaking through my clothes. The woods looked different at night. Endless, shifting shapes. Every tree a shadow. I kept running until I saw the faint outline of a ranger sign near the old trailhead. By the time I reached the ranger station, the sun was just starting to rise. My legs were shaking, my hands numb from the cold. When I finally told them where I'd come from, they called the county sheriff. Later that day, I went back with them. They found the body exactly where I said it was, and after a few hours, they found something else. A shallow pit behind the shed, half covered with a tarp. Inside it were more remains, bones mostly, some clothes, and a shovel leaning nearby. They said it looked like the man in the shed had been a missing hiker from a nearby county, gone for almost 3 weeks. As for the other remains, they were older, years old, maybe even from before my uncle's time there. No one ever figured out who had been using the place. There were no fingerprints, no tire tracks, nothing but those dragging footprints leading out into the woods and disappearing in the mud. I never went back after that. The cabin was torn down a few months later, burned down during a cleanup of the old forest properties. Sometimes I still think about those footsteps in the gravel, the slow sound of something circling the cabin while I lay there in the dark, pretending I wasn't scared. I think about how close I was to staying another night, how close whoever that was might have been to coming inside. Even now, when I take Rusty out late at night and the wind moves through the trees in that same slow way, I can still hear it, that dragging step, that uneven crunch of gravel, somewhere just behind me, fading back into the dark. It was late autumn of 2019 when I decided to spend a few days at a small wooden cabin tucked deep in the northern Montana woods. I had rented it from an old man in town who said it hadn't been used much since his brother passed. It sat near a quiet, unused trail off a dirt road that barely showed up on maps. I wanted some time away from the noise of the city. Just me, my dog Max, and the stillness of the forest. The drive took nearly 6 hours, and by the time I reached the cabin, the light was already dimming through the trees. The cabin itself was simple. One room, a small kitchen, a cot by the wall, and an old fireplace that hadn't seen a proper cleaning in years. Dust clung to the shelves, and a faint smell of mildew came from the corners. The air outside was colder than I expected for early October. Max sniffed around the place, his tail wagging low as if he was unsure about it. I unloaded the truck, stacked some firewood by the door, and started a fire to push the cold out. As night settled, the forest grew so quiet that it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I could hear the crackle of the wood and the occasional creak of the cabin's old boards expanding from the heat. Max lay on the floor beside my cot, his nose twitching every few minutes as if catching faint scents I couldn't smell. Outside, the wind brushed through the pines, and every now and then I thought I heard something light, a snap or a crunch, but it was too far to tell. I told myself it was just deer moving through the brush. That first night, I didn't sleep well. Around 2 a.m., Max woke me by standing up suddenly and staring at the window. His ears were pointed straight up, his body stiff. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was almost dark except for the faint orange glow of the coals. I could hear something faint outside, slow steps in the dead leaves, coming from behind the cabin. I stayed still, listening. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then started again, closer this time, crunching softly through the dirt and leaves. Max growled, low and quiet, his teeth slightly bared. I reached for the flashlight beside my cot and turned it on. The beam hit the wooden walls, then the window. I couldn't see anything outside, just the faint shapes of trees and my truck parked in the darkness. After a few minutes, the sounds faded. I stayed awake for a long time, listening, until I finally drifted off around dawn. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. Behind it, near the trees, I found something strange. The ground was covered in leaves, but there were clear marks, footprints, bare feet. No shoes, no boots. The prints were large, wide, and went in a half circle around the cabin before vanishing deeper into the woods. They looked fresh. I crouched down and touched one. The soil underneath was damp but not frozen, meaning whoever left them had passed sometime during the night. It didn't make sense. The nearest house was miles away, and the old dirt road leading up to the cabin hadn't shown a single sign of another vehicle. Maybe it was some hiker who got lost, I told myself. Still, something about those bare prints in the cold didn't sit right with me. I spent the day chopping more wood, trying to keep busy. Max stayed close, following me everywhere instead of exploring like he usually did. Every now and then, he would stop and stare off toward the treeline, his fur slightly raised. The forest was dead quiet again. No birds, no movement, nothing but the wind passing through the branches. By the afternoon, I noticed that strange silence more clearly. Even when I moved around, my footsteps sounded too loud, like the forest was swallowing all other sounds. When night came again, the unease grew stronger. I made sure the fire was bright, checked the locks on the door, and kept the flashlight within reach. The air was colder than before, and a faint drizzle began hitting the roof. The wind picked up, scraping the branches across the siding in long, slow scratches. Max didn't want to sleep. He sat near the window, staring out into the blackness, ears twitching at every sound. Around midnight, I heard it again. The crunch of leaves outside, slow and deliberate. Max started growling before I even moved. I turned off the lantern and stood still, trying to listen past my own heartbeat. The steps stopped near the door. Then came a soft drag sound, like someone brushing a hand or something heavier against the wood. It lasted a few seconds, then silence. I waited a long time before I dared to move. When I finally looked out through the window, I saw nothing but the faint reflection of the fire inside. The rain had picked up a bit, and I told myself again it was probably an animal. But deep down, I didn't believe that. There was something too measured about the way it moved. By morning, I decided I'd leave early. I started packing things up and went out to check the truck. The moment I stepped outside, Max barked sharply. Not his usual bark, but one that sounded scared. I looked toward the tree line and froze. About 30 yards out, there was something hanging from one of the lower branches. An old piece of torn clothing, soaked and dirty, swinging lightly in the wind. I walked closer and saw that it was a shirt, ripped badly down the front, dark stains covering most of it. It looked weathered but not ancient, maybe a few days old at most. Right beneath that branch, the ground was disturbed again. More prints, same as before. Bare feet, but this time deeper in the mud, like someone had stood there for a while. There were even drag marks nearby, faint but visible. My stomach sank. I didn't wait to look any closer. I turned back to the cabin and grabbed my bag. Before leaving, I noticed something I had missed the day before. On the side of the cabin, just under the window where Max had been staring both nights, the wood had faint smudges. Muddy handprints, smeared and uneven, as if someone had pressed their hands there to look inside. They were too high to belong to a child, and the fingers were long, thin, and oddly spaced. That was it for me. I loaded everything in the truck, got Max inside, and left that place without looking back. The road was slick and narrow, and the forest seemed to close in tighter the farther I drove. Even after I reached the main highway, I didn't stop. I didn't even go back to the man who rented me the cabin. I just left the key in his mailbox and drove home. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the property online, trying to see if there was any story behind it. I found a few old mentions in local archives, nothing detailed, just notes about missing hikers in that general area years ago. One entry from 2014 mentioned a man who had lived off-grid near those woods and disappeared without a trace. His name was Robert Haynes. There were no follow-up reports. I thought about those bare footprints and the shirt. Maybe it was nothing more than some drifter still living out there, half wild, avoiding people. Maybe he'd been watching the cabin that whole time, waiting until he realized I was leaving. Or maybe he never even noticed me at all, just wandered through the same woods that used to be his home. I never went back. Even now, when I take Max out at night and the wind shifts through the trees, that same uneasy feeling creeps back in. The silence, the way the forest seems to listen. It's been years, but I still see that image clear in my mind. The faint prints circling the cabin, the muddy hand pressed against the glass. It reminded me of something simple but heavy. The woods don't always belong to us. Sometimes we just borrow them for a while, and when we're lucky, whatever else is out there lets us leave. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a long break from everything and drive out to a small cabin I had bought deep in the woods of northern Montana. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-room wooden structure with a tin roof, a stone fireplace, and a hand pump out front for water. I bought it cheap from an old man who said no one wanted to live that far out anymore. He wasn't lying. The nearest town, Ashford, was about 30 miles away. I remember driving up that narrow dirt road, my old Ford pickup rattling over rocks, the forest pressing in on both sides like a living wall. I got there in the late afternoon. The place was silent except for the wind moving through the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and for a moment it felt peaceful. I unloaded my tools, food, and the small gas generator I'd brought. I had plans to fix the cabin up, make it livable again. The boards on the porch were soft and spongy from rot, and part of the roof sagged near the back. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust. There was one small window on each wall, a simple cot in the corner, and a table that leaned to one side. That first night, I built a fire and cooked a can of beans on the stove. The air grew cold fast. I sat by the fire listening to the sounds outside, the creak of the trees, the faint rush of wind. It was so quiet that I could hear my heartbeat. I remember thinking how far away everything was, how if something happened, I'd have no one to call. My cell phone didn't work out there. I didn't have a radio either. I tried to brush the thought off, telling myself I needed solitude. The next morning, I started repairing the back wall where a few boards had split open. As I worked, I noticed marks near the window, long, thin scratches in the wood. They looked too clean to be old. I figured maybe some animal had tried to get in. I didn't think much of it then, just patched it up and moved on. Around noon, I went down to the creek behind the cabin to get water. The creek ran cold and clear through the rocks, and I remember how still the woods felt that day. Even the birds were quiet. When I got back, I noticed something strange. My hammer, which I had left on the porch railing, was gone. I searched around for a few minutes before spotting it lying in the grass near the back wall, like it had been dropped. I told myself it must have rolled off, even though that didn't make much sense since the porch was flat. I didn't want to overthink things. By evening, the wind picked up. The trees groaned against it, and the cabin creaked. I spent that night lying on the cot, staring at the ceiling, hearing every little sound. A branch brushed the roof, something scurried under the floorboards. At one point, I could have sworn I heard soft crunching in the dirt outside, slow steps. I held still, barely breathing, but it stopped after a minute or two. I didn't go outside to check. The next morning, I found footprints near the pump. They weren't mine. They were smaller, barefoot, and looked fresh. I followed them a few yards before they vanished near the trees. The ground was covered with pine needles and leaves, so it was easy to lose them. I stood there for a while, listening. Nothing, not even the sound of birds, just that heavy, empty quiet. Over the next few days, little things kept happening. I'd wake up and find my tools moved. The door, which I knew I had latched, would be slightly open in the morning. Once, I came back from the creek and found my food canister open, even though I had tied it shut with a rope. Some of the dry food was gone. I told myself it had to be raccoons or maybe a bear, but I'd lived around wildlife before, and animals didn't move things that cleanly. One afternoon, it started raining. Hard, cold rain that soaked the ground in minutes. The sky turned dark and the forest looked almost black through the sheets of water. I stayed inside, watching the rain run down the window glass. The sound of it hitting the tin roof was deafening. Around dusk, I heard it again, that crunching sound outside. Slow, deliberate steps in the wet mud. My chest tightened. I could barely hear anything over the rain, but I knew it wasn't an animal. It was too steady, too heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and stood still, waiting. The steps stopped right near the wall where I'd fixed the boards. The light flickered once, then went out completely. I remember the silence after that, just the rain and my own breathing. I didn't move for nearly an hour, just stood there, gripping the light. When I finally worked up the nerve to look outside, there was nothing there. But in the mud near the steps, I saw new prints, bare feet again, smaller than mine, and a few of them leading right up to the door. That night, I barely slept. The generator ran out of fuel, so I sat in darkness, listening to the rain. Every time the wind shifted, the cabin made small cracking sounds, like something brushing against it. I waited for the sound of footsteps again, but it never came. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to leave. The woods didn't feel right anymore. I packed what I could into the truck, but when I turned the key, it didn't start. The battery was dead. I checked under the hood, and the cables were fine. I tried again, nothing. The truck had been working perfectly the day before. I stood there in the damp morning air, the forest pressing silent around me, feeling that cold, creeping sense that someone had been there in the night. I decided to walk. The nearest main road was about 10 miles away. I took a small backpack with water, a flashlight, and a little food, and I locked the cabin door before leaving. The trail started out clear but got rougher as I went deeper into the woods. The sky was gray, the air heavy with moisture. After about an hour, I realized I hadn't heard a single sound. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just my boots crunching through wet leaves. At some point, I came across another set of prints in the mud ahead of me, barefoot again. I stopped dead when I saw them. They were fresh. The water hadn't filled them in yet. Whoever they belonged to had come this way recently. My stomach twisted. I followed them for a bit, trying to see where they led, but they vanished again near a thick patch of brush. It started to rain again, light at first, then harder. My jacket was soaked, and the trail was turning to mud. I kept walking, trying not to look back. Around late afternoon, I finally reached the dirt road that led toward town. My legs ached, and I was shivering. When I looked back one last time, I saw the faint outline of the cabin far through the trees. The roof glinted wet in the fading light. I made it to the main road just before dark and caught a ride the next morning with a delivery truck headed toward Ashford. When I went back a week later with a tow truck to get my pickup, the cabin door was wide open. Inside, everything was torn apart. Tools scattered, mattress shredded, food containers ripped open. There were muddy footprints all over the floor, small and bare, leading from the door to the cot and then to the back wall where the boards had been replaced. The sheriff who came out with me said it was probably a squatter, maybe someone living off the land. They found signs of a small camp not far from the creek. Ashes from a fire, a few bones from small animals, and a torn blanket. Whoever it was had been watching me, waiting until I left. I sold the cabin not long after that. I didn't even go back to clean it out. Sometimes, even now, when it rains hard at night, I think about that place. The way the woods felt when everything went silent, the bare footprints in the mud, the quiet patience of whoever was out there. And I always think about how, if I hadn't left when I did, maybe those prints wouldn't have led away from the cabin. Maybe they would have stopped right next to mine. It was late October 2013 when I drove up to my cousin's dad's cabin in the northern part of Montana. I hadn't been there since I was a teenager, maybe 15 or 16 years old. Back then, it was a place where we spent summers fishing, drinking cheap beer, and pretending we were older than we were. Now, 10 years later, it felt strange going back alone. My cousin had moved away. His dad passed a few years ago, and the cabin had been sitting empty ever since. I only went because I needed to grab some old tools and check the property before it got too cold. The place had always been isolated. No nearby houses, just thick pine trees, a long gravel road, and silence that seemed heavier than it should have been. The drive up was about 4 hours from where I lived. The last 40 minutes were on a narrow dirt road that twisted through the woods, the kind where trees leaned close enough that branches scratched against the side of your car. It had rained the night before, and my tires slid in the mud a few times. My dog, Rex, sat in the passenger seat, his head resting on the window frame. He didn't seem to like the drive much either. I kept thinking about how strange it was that nobody had been out there in so long. The last person to stay in that cabin was my cousin's dad, and that was back in 2017. He was found dead there, heart attack, they said, but something about it never sat right with me. My cousin didn't talk much about it, but I remembered how quick everything happened. No funeral, no real explicación. Just gone. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sky was already dim. Clouds hung low, and a light drizzle started again. I stopped at the rusted gate, got out and pushed it open. Creaked, metal on metal, echoing too loud for the middle of nowhere. The air smelled of wet pine and old earth. Rex jumped out and ran a few feet ahead, sniffing around like he remembered the place. The cabin stood about 100 yards past the gate, sitting crooked among the trees. The roof sagged a bit, one of the windows was boarded up, and the front porch looked worse than I remembered. I parked near the steps, grabbed a flashlight, and walked up with Rex following close. The door was locked, but I had a spare key my cousin gave me years ago. The lock was stiff, but it turned after a little force. When I pushed the door open, a stale, dusty smell hit me immediately. It smelled like wet wood, mold, and something faintly metallic underneath. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight across the living room. Everything was still there. The old couch, the wooden table, a few cans of soup on the counter, and his old jacket hanging by the door. It was like time had stopped the day he died. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked through. Cobwebs hung in the corners, dust thick on every surface. I noticed a few things out of place, though. The back door was slightly open, and there were muddy footprints on the floor near the kitchen. They looked fresh, like someone had been there recently. Rex growled low, standing near the door, his ears back. I tried to tell myself it could have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or coyote. Still, I closed the door and slid the old wooden bar across it. I went to the small storage room where I remembered the tools being kept. The light switch didn't work, so I kept using my flashlight. The air in there was colder. Boxes were stacked against the walls, and an old tarp covered something large near the corner. I pulled the tarp off, and underneath were some broken chairs, a metal toolbox, and a few jars of nails. I found what I came for, a small toolbox and a few wrenches. But when I lifted the box, I noticed something strange on the floorboards beneath it. A dark stain, almost black, had seeped between the cracks in the wood. I crouched down, shining my light closer. The stain spread wider than I expected, like something had pooled there long ago. It wasn't new, but it hadn't faded either. I pressed the end of a screwdriver into it. The wood was still soft, like it had soaked up something thick. That metallic smell from earlier was stronger here. Rex started whining behind me. He wouldn't come into the room, just stood at the doorway with his tail tucked. I lifted a loose board with the flat end of the screwdriver. Came up easier than I thought. Beneath it, there was a small crawl space, maybe 2 feet deep. The smell that came out of it made my stomach turn. It wasn't just rot. It was something worse, sour and thick in the air. I pointed my flashlight down, and what I saw made my chest tighten. There was a body under there. It was mostly bones and dry skin, clothes still clinging to it. The shirt was the same plaid one I remembered my cousin's dad wearing. His hand was still curled near his chest, the skin dark and shrunken tight. It didn't look like he'd been moved or buried. More like someone had covered him up and nailed the boards back down. I froze, staring at it for a long time. My first thought was that it couldn't be him, but I knew it was. The watch on his wrist confirmed it. I'd seen him wear it dozens of times, scratched silver with a cracked face. My mouth went dry, and I just stood there, not sure what to do. My flashlight started to flicker, and Rex barked sharply from behind me, pacing back and forth. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the light. I wanted to run, but part of me couldn't leave. If his body was here, that meant he didn't die in his sleep like they said. Someone had hidden him. I tried to think who would even know about this place besides me and my cousin. There weren't any neighbors, no one around for miles. I went outside for air, sitting on the porch steps while Rex stayed close beside me. The rain had stopped, but the trees dripped steadily. The whole place felt heavy, silent except for the sound of water hitting the leaves. I thought about calling the sheriff, but my phone had no signal out here. I'd have to drive all the way back to the highway to get reception. Before I left, I decided to take one more look, just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. When I went back inside, I noticed something I hadn't before. A small pile of wood shavings near the door, like someone had been working on something recently. Then I saw the muddy footprints again, but this time there were more of them. They weren't mine. They led from the back door toward the storage room, the same room where I'd found the body. The wood near the doorway was still damp, and one of the footprints was fresh enough to glisten under the flashlight. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed my toolbox called Rex and got out of there fast. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat as I ran to the truck. I didn't even lock the door behind me. I started the engine and drove until the trees thinned and I hit the paved road again. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station about 20 miles away. I called the police from there, trying to explain what I'd found. They sent a few deputies up the next morning. I followed them back, though I didn't want to. When we got to the cabin, they went inside while I waited outside with Rex. It took them less than 10 minutes to confirm what I already knew. It was a human body, and it had been there for years. Later, they told me that it was indeed my cousin's dad. But what confused everyone was that the autopsy report showed signs of blunt trauma to the head, not a heart attack. The case that had been closed years ago was suddenly reopened. My cousin was questioned, but he had moved out of state long ago. For weeks after that, I kept thinking about that cabin, how someone had covered him up and left him there all that time. I wondered if the muddy footprints I saw that night meant someone else knew, or if they'd come back for some reason. I never found out. The cabin was torn down a few months later, and the land sold off cheap. Sometimes when I drive past that old turnoff, I still feel uneasy. Not because of ghosts or anything like that, but because I know the truth was buried there for years, hidden under the floor where no one would think to look. And somewhere out there, whoever did it had walked away free all that time. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. Every time I think about that night, the smell of wet pine and that faint metallic scent comes back to me, like it never really left. It was October of 2014 when I decided to spend a weekend alone in a cabin I'd rented deep in the woods of northern Washington. I was 28 then, working long hours at a construction company in Seattle, and I needed a break from people, from noise, from everything that made my head feel heavy. The cabin was small, single room, wooden walls darkened by years of damp air, and a thin metal roof that rattled when wind passed through the trees. It sat on the edge of an overgrown trail that led down to a lake, a place that was said to be quiet and empty most of the year. I wanted silence, and I got it, maybe too much of it. The drive there had been long, around 4 hours, through endless roads of pine and cedar, their branches hanging so low they brushed the top of my truck. The last stretch was all dirt and gravel, and I remember how the wheels kept slipping on loose stones. I reached the cabin right before dark. The air had that cold, early winter bite, and the forest looked drained of color. Everything had a kind of gray tone to it, the trees, the ground, even the sky. There were no other cabins nearby, no power lines, nothing man-made except a rusted mailbox at the start of the trail. It felt isolated in a way I wasn't used to. Inside, the cabin was plain. One small bed pushed to the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a gas stove, and a single oil lamp on a shelf. No electricity. The air smelled like wet wood and old fabric. I unpacked slowly, setting my food, water, and tools in their places. I remember how loud every sound seemed. The creak of the floorboards, the click of the lamp, the hiss of the stove. The silence outside made everything inside feel heavier. That first night was uneventful, just quiet. I sat by the window for a while, looking out at the trees. The moonlight barely touched the ground through the branches, but I could see the outline of the lake if I looked long enough. It was flat, still, and almost black. I went to bed early, wrapping myself in a thick blanket, listening to the faint rustle of wind and the occasional drip from the roof. The next morning, I decided to walk down to the lake. The path was narrow, covered in wet leaves that stuck to my boots. I noticed prints in the mud, maybe deer or elk, but there was something else mixed in, something that looked more human. Barefoot. I thought maybe it was just an illusion, maybe someone had camped around here before and left tracks. But the prints looked fresh. The cold air made me dismiss it as nothing, though I couldn't shake off a small, uncomfortable feeling in my stomach. The lake was beautiful up close, surrounded by trees that leaned over the water. I stayed there for an hour, maybe 2, skipping stones and watching the ripples fade. When I turned back to head up, I noticed something strange. There was a large piece of fabric caught in the branches of a bush beside the trail. It looked like part of a shirt, gray, torn, and stained with something brownish. I assumed it was mud. I didn't touch it. That afternoon, the weather turned. Clouds rolled in fast, and the wind carried a sound that almost felt like a low hum through the forest. The trees swayed hard, and the cabin's roof started to groan. I stayed inside, writing a few notes in a small notebook I always carried, and cooked some soup on the stove. Around dusk, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, like footsteps on gravel, but too slow to be an animal. They came from the direction of the trail. I sat still, spoon halfway to my mouth, listening. The sound paused, then came again, closer this time, like something brushing against the wooden wall of the cabin. I turned off the stove and stood by the window, but it was too dark to see. My own reflection in the glass made it worse. The noise stopped, and the woods went silent again. After maybe 10 minutes, I convinced myself it had just been the wind or a branch hitting the side. I tried to go back to eating, but my hands felt unsteady. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing small cracks outside, like twigs breaking under light steps. I kept thinking about those barefoot prints near the lake. By morning, the noise had stopped. I went outside to look around. There were marks near the side of the cabin, disturbed dirt and what looked like more prints, smaller this time, leading toward the woods. I crouched down to get a closer look, and my chest tightened. The prints were bare, clear, and deep in the soft soil. Whoever it was had been right up against the wall, maybe standing there for a while. I packed my things into the truck and decided I'd leave the next morning, but I wanted to stay through the day, just to make it feel like I wasn't running away. I spent the afternoon cleaning up the inside of the cabin, keeping my tools close. Around 5, I went to gather firewood before it got dark. The forest felt different that day, heavier, quieter. I didn't hear birds or the usual rustling in the underbrush. Every sound I made felt like it traveled too far. While walking, I noticed movement in the trees ahead. Just a flicker, something pale. I froze and waited, staring. A few seconds later, I saw it again. A person, maybe 20 yards away, half hidden behind a tree. They weren't moving, just standing there, their skin almost blending with the bark. I couldn't see their face, just the shape of their shoulders and arms. I stood there for a long time, trying to decide if I was really seeing what I thought I was. Then, without a sound, they turned and slipped deeper into the woods. I dropped the firewood and went back to the cabin. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it filled the whole space with noise. I locked the door, pushed the table against it, and sat by the window again. The forest outside looked still, but I kept catching glimpses of movement between the trees, too far to make out. That night, the cabin didn't feel like a safe place anymore. Every little sound made my body tense. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, this time circling the cabin. Slow, steady, deliberate. I turned off the lamp and crouched down beside the bed. The sound moved from one wall to another, then stopped by the door. I could hear faint breathing on the other side, the kind of slow exhale someone makes when they're trying not to be heard. I held my breath, afraid even to blink. After what felt like forever, the breathing stopped. I stayed there until dawn, barely moving. When light finally came through the cracks of the window, I gathered my things as quickly as I could. Outside, the ground near the door was covered in fresh prints, bare, small, and scattered in circles, as if someone had been pacing for hours. I didn't look back when I left. The drive out felt endless, the road twisting between the trees like it would never end. When I finally reached the highway, the sky opened up and heavy rain started to fall. It felt like some kind of release, like I'd been holding my breath for 2 days straight. I called the owner of the cabin once I got back to the city. I told him I'd left early and that someone had been on the property. He said it wasn't possible. No one lived within miles of that place. I didn't argue. I just told him I wouldn't be coming back. A week later, out of curiosity, I searched online for any reports about that area. I found a small post from a local forum mentioning that hikers had reported seeing a person living off the land near the lake that year. Someone who refused to talk, who wandered barefoot even in the cold. They said he avoided people and watched them from the woods. I never went back to that region, but sometimes, even now, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think about that breathing sound just outside the door, slow and patient, and I wonder how long he'd been there before I noticed him. I had never planned on spending a weekend alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, but life has a funny way of throwing things at you. I was in my late 20s at the time, trying to escape the chaos of city life. It was early autumn, around the end of September, and the weather was starting to cool down, especially out in the woods where I was headed. The cabin I rented was isolated. No neighbors for miles, just trees, animals, and the occasional hiker passing through. The road to the cabin was rough, gravel and dirt, winding through thick pine trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. I had no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, nothing. It was perfect for disconnecting. The cabin itself was a small, rustic structure, maybe 50 years old, with a stone fireplace, wooden floors, and an old porch swing creaking in the breeze. The air was thick with the smell of pine and earth, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. The first day was peaceful. I spent my time reading, hiking a little, and enjoying the solitude. The sun set early, and I found myself sitting on the porch with a drink, watching the sky turn purple and orange. By nightfall, the woods around the cabin felt different. There was something about the darkness in the trees, a heaviness to it, like the forest was holding its breath. As the night grew deeper, I made a fire in the fireplace and settled in with a book. There was no electricity in the cabin, just candles and a lantern. It was quiet, too quiet. The occasional rustle of leaves outside kept me on edge, but I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, maybe even a fox. Around 11:30 p.m., I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a knock, not on the door, but on the window just to the right of where I was sitting. It was faint at first, like something lightly tapping the glass. I froze, the book still in my hands, and stared at the window, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I could feel a cold shiver running down my spine, but I dismissed it, thinking it was probably an animal or the wind. Then it came again, louder this time.
A-sharp tap-tap-tap, almost rhythmic.
It was coming from the window right next to me. I slowly put my book down and got up, my feet heavy as I walked toward the window. The cabin had old wooden shutters, so I couldn't see clearly from inside, but I had the strangest feeling that something was outside, something not right. I gathered all my courage and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek out. There was nothing, just darkness and the outline of the trees in the distance. I stood there for a long moment, my breath shallow, wondering if I had imagined it. But then the tapping came again. This time it wasn't on the window, it was on the door. Knock, knock, knock. I stepped back, heart racing, wondering if someone was out there, playing a prank on me. But who would be out here? I was miles from the nearest town, and the idea of a random person wandering into my cabin at this hour seemed impossible. I grabbed the lantern from the table and stepped cautiously toward the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking, and stepped outside onto the porch. The cool air hit me immediately, sending a shiver down my spine. The cabin was still, too still. I looked around the immediate area, but there was nothing, no one, just the dark trees and the sound of the wind whispering through the branches. But as I scanned the area, I noticed something odd. The woods to the left of the cabin seemed different. There was a strange shape moving between the trees, something large, maybe 6 or 7 feet tall. It was hard to make out, but there was no mistaking the movement. It was fast, deliberate, like something was stalking me. I froze, my hand gripping the door frame, my mind racing. It wasn't an animal. It was too large for that, and it was moving in a way that didn't seem natural. The shape stopped for a moment, just at the edge of the trees, as if it was watching me. Then it moved again, this time closer. I slammed the door shut, my heart thundering in my chest. I backed away from the door, staring at the window as I tried to steady my breath. What the hell was that thing? It didn't feel like an animal. Felt wrong. I thought about grabbing my things and leaving right then. I could pack up and drive out of here in the dark, but the thought of driving down that narrow, winding road in the middle of the night, alone, terrified me more than staying in the cabin. So I did what I always did in a panic, nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that it was some animal I had misidentified in the dark. But as I sat there, trying to calm myself, the tapping came again. Only now it was coming from all sides of the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. It was on the windows, the door, even the walls. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my breath shallow. This wasn't right. It wasn't an animal. I stood up abruptly, my feet clumsy, and grabbed the lantern. I had to check outside again. I wasn't sure why I was doing it. I knew it was dangerous, but my curiosity, my need to understand what was going on, pushed me forward. I opened the door again, this time with more force, and stepped outside. The woods were eerily silent now, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. Then I heard it. A voice, low, guttural, and almost mocking, came from the darkness. Let me in. I didn't move. Couldn't. The voice wasn't human. Sounded wrong, twisted. My heart pounded as I realized with sudden clarity what was happening. I wasn't dealing with a prank or some animal. I was dealing with something much worse. The shape in the trees was moving again, but now it was closer, much closer. I could make out the form of a man, but there was something horribly off about him. His limbs were too long, his face too wide, with skin stretched too thin, like it didn't quite fit. The eyes were the worst part, black as coal, void of any humanity, gleaming in the dark. The creature tilted its head, and I could hear its bones crack as it moved toward me. I backed up, heart racing, my legs unsteady as I stumbled toward the door. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The creature took another step, and then another, its long fingers reaching toward me. I finally found my voice, a high-pitched scream that echoed through the woods as I slammed the door shut and bolted it. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't dare. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, made my skin crawl. I sat in the dark, clutching the lantern, and waited for morning. By dawn, the creature was gone, but I knew it hadn't left. It was still out there, somewhere in the woods, watching. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, too afraid to stay even one more minute. When I finally left the cabin and drove down that long road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it standing on the road behind me. I never spoke of that night to anyone. Maybe they wouldn't believe me. Maybe I didn't want to remember it myself. But I knew what I saw, and I knew it wasn't something I could ever forget. It was late October of 2013 when I drove out to a farm in Northumberland, up in the northern part of England. The property had belonged to my uncle, but after he passed away, it had been left empty for years. I'd recently gone through a bad breakup and needed space. Somewhere quiet, away from people. The cabin on that farm seemed like the right kind of solitude. It sat about a mile from the nearest road, surrounded by wide, empty fields and thick patches of woodland that always seemed to hold the mist longer than anywhere else. When I arrived, it was already dusk. The drive up the dirt track was rough, with patches of mud so deep my tires slipped a few times. The cabin itself was small, made of old timber that had turned gray with time. The roof sagged a little on one side, and weeds had grown through the steps of the porch. There was a small barn next to it, with the door hanging off one hinge. Everything smelled faintly of damp soil and animal musk. Inside, the cabin was simple. One room, a bed, a small stove, and an old table by the window. Dust covered nearly every surface, and cobwebs stretched across the corners. I lit a kerosene lamp and unpacked my things, trying not to think too much about how isolated I was. There was no electricity, no phone signal. I brought some food, bottled water, a small generator, and enough fuel to last a week. That first night, the silence was heavy. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get in a city when everything's asleep. It was deeper. The only sounds came from outside. The distant croak of frogs, the wind brushing against the walls, the occasional creak of the wood settling. Around midnight, I heard something that sounded like metal scraping softly against metal. Came from the direction of the barn. I tried to ignore it, thinking it could be the wind shifting the loose door, but it kept happening, slow and uneven. I didn't go outside that night. The next morning, I walked over to check. The barn was mostly empty except for some rusted tools, broken fencing, and a few old sacks of animal feed. The smell inside was stronger than I remembered, like rot mixed with something sour. I found the source of the noise easily enough. A large chain hung from the ceiling beam, swinging slightly as if it had been moving for a long time. I stopped it and went back to the cabin, uneasy but trying not to overthink it. Days passed in a strange rhythm. I'd wake up, make coffee on the stove, take long walks through the fields, and sometimes try to clear out parts of the barn or fix small things around the cabin. But every evening, as it got dark, the atmosphere changed. The air turned colder, and the sounds outside grew sharper, like someone moving slowly through the grass or the distant echo of footsteps across the dirt. I kept telling myself it was just animals. Still, I started locking the cabin door at night and keeping my flashlight close. One evening, as the light faded, I noticed movement at the far end of the field. It was a figure, thin, hunched, wearing something dark. At first, I thought it was just a scarecrow or maybe some farmer walking along the boundary. But then it moved again, slightly closer, stopping whenever I looked in its direction. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I watched for a long time until the figure seemed to blend into the mist. That night, I barely slept. Over the next few days, I started noticing small things around the cabin. Footprints in the mud near the porch. A set of fingerprints smudged on the window glass that I was sure hadn't been there before. Once, I found the back door slightly open even though I'd locked it. I checked the lock. It was old and could easily have slipped, but something about it felt deliberate. I kept a knife by my bed after that. By the fifth night, the unease had turned into something heavier. I hadn't seen the figure again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a dull thumping sound. It came from outside, steady and rhythmic, like someone hitting wood with a slow, measured force. I sat still for a while, trying to place it. Then I realized it was coming from the barn. I thought maybe a branch had come loose, maybe something had fallen, but the rhythm was too even. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and went to the window. The barn door was swinging open and shut in the wind, slamming against the wall. Each time it hit, the sound echoed across the field. I felt a wave of relief, just the door, nothing more. But then I noticed something else. Between each slam, when the door swung open, I caught glimpses of something inside. It wasn't clear, just a dark shape, hunched and still. The light from the moon made it look almost human, but I couldn't be sure. I didn't go out there that night. I sat awake until dawn, listening to that door creak and bang until the sound faded with the morning wind. When daylight came, I went to check. The barn was empty again. Nothing out of place except for one thing I hadn't noticed before. A piece of cloth caught on a nail near the doorway. It looked like part of a dark jacket, torn and frayed at the edge. I picked it up and noticed that it smelled faintly of sweat and old smoke. That's when I realized it couldn't have been there for long. The rain from 2 nights ago would have washed it clean if it had been. That was the moment I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things slowly, trying not to think about what any of it meant. Before leaving, I took one last look around the property. The fields stretched out endlessly, the mist just starting to rise again. The whole place looked calm and still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been there with me the entire time. As I walked toward my car, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud leading from the barn to the edge of the woods. They were long, with deep impressions, as if whoever made them was carrying something heavy. They stopped right where the trees began. I stood there for a while, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing, just the slow sway of branches and the distant caw of a crow. I left that place later that morning. When I drove back down the dirt track, I looked once in the rearview mirror. Through the fading fog, I thought I saw a shape standing near the cabin, right by the porch, still almost like it was watching. But I didn't stop. A week after I got back home, I couldn't get the farm out of my head. I looked up the property records, trying to find some explanation. It turned out that a few years before my uncle died, a farmhand had gone missing from that same land. He'd been living in the barn temporarily while working there, and one day he just disappeared. The police assumed he left town. They never found a body. Thinking back, I realized that the torn piece of jacket looked like something from an old work uniform. The chain in the barn, the smell, the footprints, all of it started to make a strange kind of sense. Maybe he hadn't left at all. Maybe he'd been living out there, surviving somehow, hidden in the woods or sleeping inside the barn when no one was around. I still don't know if the figure I saw was him, or if it was someone else using that abandoned land for reasons I'll never understand. But I know for sure that something or someone was there with me. And every now and then, when I drive through the countryside and see a field covered in fog, I get that same uneasy feeling again. The sense that there are places out there where people vanish quietly, not because of anything supernatural, but because the world is full of dark corners where no one ever looks. And that farm, that lonely cabin in Northumberland, is one of them. It was late in the afternoon when I arrived at the cabin. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, and the light cast long, eerie shadows on the forest floor. I had rented this old hunting cabin deep in the woods for a weekend getaway, hoping for some solitude and time to clear my head. The place had been on a rental site for years, and the reviews had all been positive. People described it as rustic, quiet, and perfect for anyone wanting to disconnect. I figured it would be a peaceful escape. Little did I know that by the time I left, I would have wished for a lot more noise and a lot more company. The road leading up to the cabin was nothing more than a rough dirt track. It had rained the day before, so the mud was thick and slippery. My truck slid a few times, but I eventually made it to the clearing where the cabin stood. It was an old, weather-beaten structure, 2 stories with a sagging roof and dark wooden panels that seemed to absorb the last of the daylight. The windows were dirty, and the front porch had a couple of loose boards. But despite the rundown appearance, there was something oddly inviting about it. A place untouched by time, it seemed. I stepped out of the truck, the cool air hitting my face. It was refreshing after the humid heat of the drive. My boots sunk into the mud as I grabbed my bag and walked toward the cabin. As I approached, I heard the crunch of leaves underfoot and realized just how quiet it was out here. Not a bird, not an insect, nothing. That's when I noticed something strange. A faint smell in the air, something almost like wet dog or maybe rotting wood. I figured it was just the dampness of the forest, and I dismissed it as nothing to worry about. The door creaked open as I pushed it, and I stepped inside. The cabin smelled old, musty, like it hadn't been aired out in months. There was no electricity, just a couple of kerosene lamps hanging from the walls. The furniture was sparse, an old couch covered in a dusty, threadbare blanket, a stone fireplace, and a few wooden tables. A large hunting rifle hung on the wall next to a collection of mounted animal heads. I couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable, staring at those glassy-eyed trophies. I dropped my bag on the floor and made my way to the fireplace. It looked like it had been used recently, as the ashes inside were still warm. I grabbed a few logs from the small stack in the corner and started a fire. As the flames crackled and popped, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. At least now I had some warmth. I kicked off my boots, sank into the worn couch, and opened a book I had brought along, hoping to settle in for a quiet night. But the quiet out here was unnerving. Not just the silence, but the way everything felt so still. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. I couldn't explain it, but something about the atmosphere made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. By the time night fell, the fire was the only source of light in the cabin. I closed the book and lay back, staring at the ceiling. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from the far side of the cabin. I froze. The noise was too quiet to be an animal. It almost sounded like something or someone was scraping the wall. I tried to rationalize it. The wind, maybe, or the house settling. But there was something in the back of my mind telling me that wasn't it. I stood up, grabbed a flashlight from my bag, and walked over to the source of the noise. The wall was just a solid piece of wood, weathered and rough. There was no sign of damage, no loose boards. Yet the noise continued, faint but distinct. I flashed the light around, trying to make sense of it. Nothing. Just the shadows from the fire flickering against the walls. I checked the windows, the door, but everything was locked tight. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The night stretched on, and I tried to ignore the unsettling noise. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, though I didn't know what kind of animal could make that sound. I had just started to doze off when a sudden, sharp noise broke the silence. A loud bang, like something heavy had been dropped outside. I jumped to my feet, heart racing. My first thought was that someone was out there, maybe some other hunter or hiker who had gotten lost. But I quickly pushed that thought away. The cabin was in a remote location. It was nearly impossible for anyone to just wander out here. I grabbed the rifle from the wall. I didn't know how to use it, but it made me feel safer, like it would somehow protect me from whatever was out there. I crept toward the front door and peered out the small window next to it. The darkness outside was thick and impenetrable, and I couldn't make out anything beyond the porch. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone walking through the mud. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the subtle shift of weight. I stood there, listening, the weight of the rifle in my hands heavy and uncomfortable. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I call the police? Should I hide? Then, without warning, the door slammed open. I stumbled back, heart in my throat, rifle raised in front of me. But there was no one there. The door had swung wide, the wind now howling through the trees. I rushed to shut it, my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when I saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, just beyond the threshold. They were too high up to be a normal animal, and they reflected the light of the fire. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The eyes were watching me, unmoving. Suddenly, the creature stepped forward into the light, its shape becoming clearer. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, and its body was hunched, like it had been twisted or malformed. Its skin was pale, almost sickly white, and it was covered in patches of matted fur. The face, though, God, the face. It was human-like, but not quite. The features were distorted, exaggerated, like someone had taken a human and tried to make it into something else. I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing for a way out. I didn't know what the hell I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't something I wanted to be near. Without thinking, I fired the rifle, the loud shot deafening in the still night. But the creature didn't flinch. It just stared at me, its eyes cold and unblinking. I ran, not caring about anything except putting distance between myself and that thing. I bolted out the back door, into the woods, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, where I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When the engine roared to life, I didn't look back. I drove all night, not daring to stop until I was far from that cabin, far from whatever it was that had been watching me. The next day, I went back to the rental site and told them what happened. They didn't seem surprised, almost like they had heard it before. They told me the cabin had been abandoned for years before they started renting it out. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was some kind of creature, maybe it was a person. Someone who had been living out there in the woods, hidden from the world. All I know is, I'm never going back to that cabin, and I'll never forget the eyes that watched me from the darkness. It was late October of 1998 when I got assigned to the remote ranger cabin near White Hollow Lake in northern Montana. I had been working as a park ranger for nearly 6 years, but this was my first time being stationed alone in such an isolated area. The cabin sat about 20 miles from the nearest main road, tucked deep between thick pine woods and a steep rocky ridge. It was the kind of place where the silence had a weight to it, where even small noises seemed to stretch across miles of forest. The drive up had taken me most of the day. The dirt road was narrow and filled with potholes, half of it washed out by rain from the week before. By the time I arrived, the light was fading behind the ridge, and the air had that heavy, cold smell that meant winter wasn't far off. The cabin itself was old but solid, a single-story log structure with a small porch, a tin roof, and a brick chimney that leaned slightly to one side. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a wood stove, a narrow bed, a small table, and shelves lined with old ranger manuals and maps that looked decades old. The job wasn't complicated. I was supposed to check on the area, keep an eye out for illegal hunting, and monitor wildlife activity before the park officially closed for the season. It was the kind of assignment that no one else wanted. Long, quiet nights and little to do except make reports and patrol trails that hardly anyone used anymore. But I didn't mind being alone. I actually preferred it most days. The first few nights were uneventful. I got into a routine. Wake up early, walk the perimeter trails, check camera traps, and write up notes before sunset. At night, I'd sit by the stove with a cup of coffee, listening to the faint sounds of the forest. The wind brushing through pine branches, the occasional crack of a branch, or the distant hoot of an owl. There was comfort in the rhythm of it, but that comfort didn't last long. On the fourth night, something felt off. It had started raining hard after sunset, and the wind had picked up, rattling the loose metal on the roof. I was writing a report when I heard it, a dull thud somewhere outside the cabin. It wasn't close, but it was heavy enough to make me stop writing. I waited, listening. Another thud, this time followed by a dragging sound, like something being pulled through wet leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The rain came down in sheets, the beam of light barely cutting through it. At first, I thought it might have been an elk or maybe a fallen branch, but then I noticed footprints near the edge of the porch. Large, deep prints in the mud that didn't look like boots or animal tracks. They were uneven, like whoever made them was limping. I followed them a few steps out, shining the light toward the tree line, but the rain blurred everything. After a few minutes, I gave up and went back inside, telling myself it could have been a hunter or a hiker caught in the storm. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing small noises, faint taps on the porch, the sound of movement in the woods, sometimes even what I thought was breathing near the window. Every time I checked, there was nothing there but darkness and rain. The next morning, the rain had stopped. I went outside to check the area in daylight. The ground was torn up near the tree line, as if something heavy had moved through. A few feet beyond that, I found blood-dark, dried patches leading toward the ridge. It wasn't much, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I followed the trail for about a mile before it disappeared into a thicket of pines. I didn't find any animal remains or signs of a struggle, but I felt that strange heaviness again, like being watched. I turned back sooner than I normally would have. That evening, the weather cleared, and the forest went unusually quiet. No birds, no insects, just stillness. I sat on the porch, drinking instant coffee from a tin mug, when I saw something across the clearing, a dark shape moving between the trees. It was upright, tall, maybe a man. I couldn't tell in the fading light, but it moved strangely slow, then sudden, then still again. I stood up, but when I turned on my flashlight, the figure was gone. The next few days, I kept noticing small things out of place. My supply box outside had been opened one morning. The lock wasn't broken, but the lid was half off, and one of the rope coils was missing. A camera trap I'd set near the lake had been pulled down and tossed into the water. Footprints appeared near the back window again, but this time they led toward the ridge instead of away. I started carrying my rifle on patrol, something I usually avoided unless necessary. By the 8th night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was circling the cabin after dark. Around midnight, I woke up to the faint sound of something scraping against the back wall. I froze, listening, stopped, then started again, slow, deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and moved quietly toward the window, but when I looked out, all I saw were streaks of water running down the glass. I waited there for several minutes until the sound finally faded. The next morning, I found the marks on the outside wall. They weren't scratches from an animal. They looked like tool marks, maybe from a knife or metal object, dragged down the wood. I started to wonder if someone was messing with me. Maybe a hunter trying to scare me off or a local who didn't like park rangers. Still, the nearest town was 30 miles away, and there hadn't been any vehicles on the road in over a week. By the 10th day, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept properly since that storm. Every sound made me jump. I decided to pack some of my gear and spend the next day hiking down to the main outpost. Before leaving, I planned to check one last trail camera near the ridge, the one facing the north trail. It was late afternoon when I reached it. The air was colder up there, and the woods felt tighter, denser. When I checked the camera, I noticed the memory card was missing. The strap that held the device was half torn off, and the bark behind it was scraped raw. I looked around and saw the same uneven footprints in the mud, leading deeper up the trail. Against my better judgment, I followed them a short way. About 50 yards ahead, I found a small clearing with pieces of rope tangled in branches. The same kind of rope that had gone missing from my supply box. In the center of the clearing was a torn-up tarp, dirt piled around it like someone had been digging recently. There was a smell too, sharp and metallic like rust and decay. I didn't stay to look closer. I turned back fast, feeling my pulse in my throat the whole way down. When I reached the cabin, the sun was already dropping, and the light was fading through the trees. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and sat awake by the stove all night with my rifle across my lap. The first light, I packed up and left. I didn't even bother cleaning up. I drove straight to the ranger outpost, radioed in, and told them I was done with that station. I filed a brief report, left out most of what I'd seen, only mentioning the disturbed ground near the ridge and possible illegal hunting activity. A few days later, another ranger team went out to check the site. They said they found signs of an old campsite and a shallow pit filled with animal bones, probably from poaching. That's what the official report said anyway. But I knew what I saw. Those footprints weren't from boots, and the way that tarp was buried didn't look like someone dressing game. I still remember that smell, the dragging sounds, the scraping against the wall. I never went back to White Hollow after that. The cabin's still there, I'm told, though no one's been assigned to it in years. Every now and then, when I look at the old maps in the office, I find that spot by the lake and feel that same heavy quiet in my chest. The same silence I felt out there, the kind that presses in from every side until it feels like the woods themselves are listening. It was late October of 2013, and I had taken a few days off work to get away from everything. My head was a mess from months of long shifts and endless city noise. So when a friend mentioned an old cabin outside of Whitby, near the edge of an abandoned graveyard, I thought it sounded perfect. He told me the cabin was still standing but hadn't been used in years. I didn't mind. I wasn't looking for comfort. I just wanted quiet and space to breathe. The drive there took most of the day. The last stretch was nothing but a narrow dirt road winding through miles of empty countryside. The trees grew thicker the further I went, their bare branches scraping against my truck as if warning me to turn around. The air felt heavy, damp, and cold even though it wasn't quite winter yet. I remember seeing the first few gravestones just as the sun started sinking. They looked worn and tilted, half swallowed by weeds and mud, the carved names fading away with time. The cabin stood a short distance beyond the graveyard, on a slight rise. It was smaller than I expected, built of dark wood that had gone nearly black from years of weather. The roof sagged in the middle, and the single window was boarded halfway shut. When I stepped out of the truck, the ground squelched beneath my boots. Everything smelled like wet leaves and old soil. Inside, the air was stale but still. Dust floated in the last bit of daylight coming through the cracks in the boards. There was a small wood stove in one corner, a rickety table, and a narrow bed frame without a mattress. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I unpacked my few things: sleeping bag, lantern, some canned food, and started cleaning the stove so I could make a fire before dark. By the time I got the fire going, night had already taken over. The woods around the cabin were completely silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just that deep, empty kind of silence that makes you notice your own heartbeat. I sat by the stove for a while, eating from a can, trying not to think about how far I was from anyone. My phone barely had a signal, maybe 1 bar at best. After a few hours, I decided to walk out back to stretch my legs. I brought my flashlight and wandered toward the graveyard. The beam of light caught on the damp stones and broken crosses. There were dozens of graves, some sunken into the earth, others marked only by rotting wood stakes. I noticed one grave near the middle that looked recently disturbed. The soil was loose, darker than the rest. There was no fresh marker, just a splintered piece of wood lying nearby. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, wondering who had been buried there and why the ground looked so uneven. The longer I stared, the more uneasy I felt, so I turned back to the cabin. Inside, I shut the door tight and slid a piece of wood across it. The fire had burned low, so I added another log and tried to get comfortable in my sleeping bag. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing faint noises outside. Not voices, but movement, leaves crunching. Once or twice, it sounded like footsteps circling the cabin. I told myself it was animals, maybe a deer or fox, but the sounds were too slow, too deliberate. Sometime after midnight, I heard a sharp noise at the window, like someone brushing against it. I sat up instantly, heart pounding. My flashlight was in my hand before I even thought about it. I pointed it toward the sound, but the beam only caught the reflection of the dirty glass and my own shaky hand. Then there was silence again, deep and heavy. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting near the fire, listening. I could hear the faint ticking of the metal stove as it cooled and the occasional creak of the walls in the cold air. By morning, my nerves were raw. When I stepped outside, I noticed tracks in the mud around the cabin. They weren't boot prints, more like someone had walked barefoot through the wet soil. The steps circled the cabin twice, then disappeared into the tall grass toward the graveyard. I told myself maybe someone had been out here before me, maybe a hiker or local kid. I didn't want to overthink it. I tried to go about my day, collected some firewood, boiled coffee on the stove, and sat outside for a bit. But I kept glancing toward that graveyard. From where I sat, I could see the disturbed patch of dirt clearly. It almost looked like it had sunk lower since last night. By late afternoon, the sky turned gray and it started to drizzle. The cold wind picked up, rattling the cabin walls. I decided I'd stay one more night, then leave in the morning. As it got dark again, the uneasy feeling returned, stronger this time. The noises started earlier too, right after sunset. I heard faint crunches, pauses, then more movement. It wasn't random, it was slow, cautious, like something trying not to be heard. Around midnight, the sound came right up to the door. I could hear the wood shifting slightly, like pressure being put on it. I grabbed the small hatchet I'd brought and waited, barely breathing. The sound stopped for a while, then shifted toward the window. There was a soft scrape against the glass again, longer this time. I didn't move. I didn't even dare shine the flashlight, afraid of what I might see. It went quiet for a while, long enough that I thought maybe it was over. Then, from outside, there came a low, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the ground. It started near the graveyard and slowly came closer, through the grass until it was right outside. The sound lasted for maybe a minute, then stopped completely. I sat there frozen, the fire burning low again, until eventually exhaustion took over and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. When I woke, the light coming through the cracks told me it was morning. The rain had stopped, but everything outside looked soaked and heavy. I stepped out and looked around. The ground in front of the cabin was torn up, deep grooves in the mud, like something heavy had been dragged right to the door. I followed the marks a few feet before I noticed they went all the way back toward the graveyard. The disturbed grave was different now. The soil had collapsed inward, leaving a shallow, uneven pit. Something dark was sticking out of the dirt, maybe a piece of fabric or wood. I didn't go any closer. My stomach felt tight and sick. Whatever had happened here, I didn't want to be a part of it. I packed my things fast, throwing everything back into the truck. Before I left, I looked once more toward the graveyard. The fog was thick, rolling between the trees, and through it I thought I saw movement. Just a flicker, like someone ducking low among the stones. I got in the truck and started it up, the tires spinning in the mud before catching the firmer ground. The road back felt longer than before. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone walking behind me, but there was nothing, just that gray fog swallowing everything. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. I didn't even know what to think, if it had been someone messing around, or if I'd stumbled into something I shouldn't have seen. All I knew was that whatever had been out there, it wasn't natural for anyone to be wandering around barefoot in freezing rain, circling cabins in the dark. I never told anyone about it. I just said the cabin wasn't what I expected and left it at that. But every now and then, especially in the middle of the night when the world feels too quiet, I think about those footprints, the dragging sounds, and that half-collapsed grave. I think about what might have been under that soil and who or what decided it didn't want to stay there anymore. And the worst part is, sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that soft scrape against the window.